Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1:01, so we're going to start this session. You will have heard the mention that this session is being recorded, so it will be available after the session for participants and for individuals and organizations that request it. So thank you all for being here today. My name is Marie-Hélène Lévesque. I'm the Director General of the Law Enforcement Directorate here at Public Safety Canada. And I am joined by colleagues from the Supply Chains Task Force. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Kichizibi, known as the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. I honor their long history of welcoming other nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. I recognize their amazing resistance, resilience, and strength. And I also wish to acknowledge the lands that our participants are joining from across the country today. I am pleased to welcome you today to this information session, which will provide an overview of the bill that was known as Bill S-211, an act to enact the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act, and to amend the Customs Tariff. So we will call it the Supply Chains Act throughout this session. Please note that due to the amount of participants that have registered, the chat function is not currently accessible. However, we've been taking note of each email and question that you have sent to Public Safety Canada, and we will aim to answer those questions at the end of this presentation. If your question has not been covered, we encourage you to email us. We will be adding any information that requires clarification to our guidance, and we'll continue to notify stakeholders when additional information is provided on our website. If you do not have our email address yet, we will share it at the end of this presentation. As mentioned previously, this presentation will be recorded. Those in our mailing list will receive the link to the recording via email in the coming days. And you can also email us if you wish to be added to our mailing list. I will also add that if there are requests for additional sessions, we will be considering additional dates as well. On screen right now is the proposed overview of today's presentation. This presentation will seek to clarify the scope of the Supply Chains Act, including the main steps and components of the reporting process. You will notice at the end of the session, we will cover frequently asked questions, which we hope will address questions you may currently have, and any other questions will be addressed, as previously mentioned, through the email process. The Supply Chain Act imposes an obligation on certain government institutions and private sector entities to report on the measures taken to prevent and reduce the risk that forced labor or child labor is used by them or in their supply chains. The Supply Chains Act also amends the Customs Tariff to allow for a prohibition on the importation of goods manufactured or produced in whole or in part by forced labor or child labor as defined in the Supply Chains Act. The objective of this law is to compel Canadian companies to publicly declare what actions they are taking to address forced labor and child labor. However, while organizations subject to the Supply Chains Act are now required to explain in an annual report their efforts to combat forced labor and child labor, The Supply Chains Act does not place obligations on entities and government institutions to undertake any concrete or responsive actions to address wrongdoings, aside from completing the report. The intent of the Supply Chains Act is to encourage responsible business practices. It aims to increase industry awareness and transparency about forced labor and child labor by requiring entities to publicly report on what they're doing to reduce the risk of these practices in how they conduct their business. As entities, government institutions, and Canadians become aware of their risk exposure, and we hope improvements will be done over time to prevent those human rights violations from taking place. The Supply Chains Act received royal assent on May 11, 2023, and came into force on January 1st, 2024. Public Safety Canada is the federal lead responsible to implement the legislation and is required to maintain an electronic registry of all reports received on the public safety website. The Minister of Public Safety is also responsible for tabling an annual report to Parliament, summarizing all the reports submitted. Public Safety Canada has created a website to support the implementation of the Supply Chains Act, which you now see on screen. On our website, you can find information about the reporting obligations, how to prepare a report, how to submit a report, and additional resources, including tools and guidelines that highlight best practices to address forced labor and child labor risks in global supply chains. The website also contains information on the federal government's response to these issues. We'll begin our session by discussing the definition of entity in order to determine which entities have reporting obligations under the Supply Chains Act. First, I'd like to show you where you can find this information on our website. You can go to prepare a report, and then under guidance for entities, you select guidance on the application of the Act, as shown by the red arrow on the screen. As defined in Section 2 of the Supply Chains Act, an entity means a corporation or a trust, partnership, or other unincorporated organization that is one of three things: that is either listed on a stock exchange in Canada, that has a place of business in Canada, that does business in Canada or has assets in Canada, and that based on its consolidated financial statements meets at least two of the three following conditions in its two most recent financial years. So it has either $20 million in assets, generated at least $40 million in revenue, or employs an average of at least 250 employees. It can also be described by regulations. In order to determine if you're an entity under the Act, you need to ask the following question. Are you a corporation, a trust, a partnership, or another unincorporated organization? If you answered no, then you are not an entity under the law. If you answered yes, the question now becomes, are you listed on a stock exchange in Canada? If you are listed on a stock exchange in Canada, you are an entity. If you are not listed on the stock exchange in Canada, you must determine if you have a place of business in Canada, do business in Canada, or have assets in Canada. And if you did answer yes to any of those questions, you must determine whether you meet at least two of the following conditions for at least one of your two most recent financial years. Do you have at least $20 million in assets? Have you generated at least $40 million in revenue? Or do you employ an average of at least 250 employees? If you fulfill at least two of these three size thresholds, then you are considered an entity under the Supply Chains Act. Please note that not all entities have reporting obligations under the Act, and we will cover that in this next section. So, which entities have reporting obligations? An entity has reporting obligations if they produce, sell, or distribute goods in Canada or elsewhere, if they import into Canada goods produced outside of Canada, or if they control an entity engaged in any activities described in A or B, meaning any entity producing, selling, distributing, or importing goods. While the Act does not prescribe a minimum value of goods an entity must produce, sell, or distribute, or import, these terms should be understood to exclude minor dealings. You should note an entity is deemed to be importing goods if the entity is responsible for accounting for those goods under the Customs Act. It does not include goods purchased from a third party who is the importer under the Customs Act. If an entity does not meet these criteria, they are not required to report under the Supply Chains Act. Entities must determine if they have reporting obligations under the Supply Chains Act based on the facts and circumstances of their own situation. Now let's go over how to determine if an entity will be required to report under the Act one more time. If you meet the definition of entity discussed previously, you have to determine whether you produce, sell, or distribute goods in Canada or elsewhere. If yes, then you are required to report. If you do not produce, sell, or distribute goods in Canada or elsewhere, you must then ask yourself whether you import goods into Canada that are produced outside of Canada. If you determine your answer to be yes, you are importing goods, then you are required to report. If you do not import into Canada goods produced outside Canada, you must then determine if you control an entity that produces, sells, or distributes goods in Canada or elsewhere, or that imports into Canada goods that are produced outside of Canada. If you answered no to the last question, you are not required to report under the Act. However, if you answered yes to the last question, you are a reporting entity. Now let's talk about the reporting process that's been established for this reporting year. There are 5 steps entities must follow in order to complete their reporting requirements under the Act. We'll talk in more detail about each of these steps. First, you must prepare a report. entities should consult the guidance document and resources to develop their own annual report. Second, obtain approval and attestation. Entities must seek approval from their governing bodies on the report that they will be submitting. Third, complete the online questionnaire. Entities must answer all questions addressing each of the requirements under the Supply Chains Act. 4, upload the completed report. Entities must attach a PDF report and submit the questionnaire to Public Safety Canada. And the 5th step, publish the report on the entity website. Entities must make the report publicly available on their own websites. When it comes time to preparing their report, entities will find guidance under the Prepare a Report section of the website. There, you will find information on process overview, the report requirements, and the questionnaire. The report must include information on the steps that the entity has taken during its previous financial year to prevent and reduce the risk that forced labor or child labor is used at any step of the production of goods in Canada or elsewhere by the entity, or of goods imported into Canada by the entity. Our website includes a section on report contents where entities can find guidance on what information they can include to respond to each requirement of the Act. As part of the reporting requirements, entities must provide information on its structure, activities, and supply chains, its policies and its due diligence processes in relation to forced labor and child labor, the parts of its business and supply chains which carry a risk of forced labor or child labor being used, and the steps it has taken to assess and manage that risk. Any measures taken to remediate any forced labor or child labor, any measures taken to remediate the loss of income to the most vulnerable families, which result from any measures taken to eliminate the use of forced labor or child labor in its activities and supply chains, must also include the training provided to employees on forced labor and child labor, and finally, how the entity assesses its effectiveness in ensuring forced labor and child labor are not being used in its business and supply chains. Public Safety Canada understands, given the recent coming into force of the Supply Chains Act, that entities may not have measures to report on for some or all of the requirements. You are able to state that in your report, and you would still comply with the Act. You are also able to provide in your reports and in the questionnaire information on actions you have taken that could address forced labor and child labor. For example, if you have put in place action plans or codes of conduct. If entities have assessed that their activities and supply chains do not carry a risk of forced labor or child labor, then stating this in their report would be sufficient to comply with the Act. As mentioned, entities may also indicate that no measures have been taken to remediate forced labor or child labor risks in their activities and supply chains, if that is the case. They should indicate this in their questionnaire and in their report, and doing so would be sufficient to meet the entity's legal obligations. There are specific requirements entities must abide by in producing a report. They must include information addressing each of the requirements under the Supply Chains Act, as we just discussed. The report must be approved by the appropriate governing body of the entity and include a signed attestation. The report must be in PDF format and must not exceed 100 megabytes in size. It is recommended that the report does not exceed 10 pages in length or 20 pages if it's submitted in both official languages, although that is not a requirement. In their reports, entities may include additional information, visual aids, or other types of visual information, as long as they follow the specific requirements. The level of detail is left at the discretion of entities. The online questionnaire may be used as a template as well, and it includes multiple examples of measures entities can refer to when answering each of the Act's requirements. Please remember that reports should use simple, clear language and explain any unfamiliar terms, should not include acronyms, and be generally accessible to the public. Before we move on to the next section, I would like to emphasize that the report should not include any commercially sensitive information or references to cases of forced or child labor, which can compromise the privacy or the safety of any persons or groups. Once an entity has completed their report, it must be approved by its governing body. The process includes both a statement confirming the governing body has approved the report, as well as signatures by one or more members of the governing body of each entity which is approving the report. If a report involves multiple entities, each entity's governing body must approve the joint report, or the governing body of the entity that controls entities must be included in the report. The signed attestation must be included in the PDF version of an entity's report using the wording and formatting requirements outlined on the Public Safety Canada webpage. You can see it on the screen in the blue square right now. Entities are required to fill out the questionnaire in addition to completing their reports. We recommend that you complete the development of your report first, including the approval and attestation, and then proceed to fill out the questionnaire, since at the end of the questionnaire, you'll be required to upload your report. The questionnaire includes both mandatory and optional questions. The mandatory questions collect identifying information about the entity and information on the Supply Chains Act reporting requirements. The optional open-ended questions allow entities to elaborate on the responses so that they may provide additional information. The reporting process requires entities to provide answers to closed questions for data collection purposes and allows reporting entities to provide additional information if desired, as well as the ability to upload and refer to their own report for more information. As mentioned earlier, entities may use the questionnaire as a template for their own report using the questionnaire available in the text format on our website. This allows entities to view the complete list of required information without launching the online questionnaire software, and entities may easily refer to the information as they prepare their report. The text version of the questionnaire can be found on the Submit a Report page under View Questions, as shown on the slide. The link to complete the questionnaire and to upload the report is available on the Public Safety Canada webpage. When ready to complete the questionnaire and upload the report, entities may launch the questionnaire by clicking on Launch Questionnaire under Submit a Report. Please note that only the report must be published on an entity's website and not the questionnaire. Similarly, Public Safety will only be posting the approved PDF reports in our online catalog. An entity may submit a joint report covering its own actions and those of any entities it controls, or which covers multiple entities belonging to the same corporate group. A joint report should only be submitted if the information provided generally applies to all entities covered by the report. A joint report must receive approval from the governing bodies of each entity covered by the report. Entities should file individual reports and not joint reports when the information for each reporting entity differs significantly. Entities may also provide the Minister of Public Safety with a revised version of their report. The revised version must, in addition to the mandatory information, indicate the date of the revision and include the description of the changes made to the original report. Once an entity has submitted the report to the Minister of Public Safety, it must make the report available to the public by publishing it in a prominent place on its website. Though entities have discretion over the placement on their own website, the report must be visible and readily accessible to the public. For those entities that don't have a website, they must be able to provide a copy of the report to any member of the public that requests it. Public Safety Canada is also responsible to publish the entity's reports on their webpage in a searchable online catalog. As stipulated by the Supply Chains Act, entities are required to report to the Minister of Public Safety on or before May 31st annually on the measures to prevent the risk that forced labor or child labor were used in their supply chains in the previous financial year. Entities have the liberty to submit their report anytime before January 1st and May 31st. Public Safety Canada will present a summary report to Parliament by September 30th of each year, which will also be publicly available within 30 days after it is tabled in both houses of Parliament. Throughout this presentation, we've been showing the different sections of our website where you can find information on the reporting process and guidance to help entities understand their obligations. The information we just covered can be found under the Prepare a Report Entities webpage. In there, entities can find detailed guidance on preparing a report, on the application of the Act, and on the report content. Entities can also use the Resources link provided at the bottom of the webpage to access international tools and best practices pertaining to responsible business conduct, and on how to strengthen capacity to address forced labor and child labor in their global supply chains. We have put together a few points of clarification that were identified in our frequently asked questions, and we've received since additional questions on the guidance available on our website. So first off, I'd like to address the questions related to determining whether an entity has a business presence in Canada. Entities should use the ordinary meaning of place of business, of doing business, and has assets in Canada, since those terms are not properly defined in the Supply Chains Act. Tax and employment-related records should be considered to determine whether an entity has a place of business, does business, or has assets in Canada, taking into account the ordinary sense of the words, as well as the location of goods, employees, deliveries, assets, inventories, and bank accounts. Doing business in Canada does not require having brick and mortar in Canada. Linked to this, we've received a number of questions pertaining to determining whether an entity is a reporting entity under the Act. Remember that in order to have reporting obligations, you must first meet the definition of entity under the Act. So you must be a corporation, trust, partnership, or other unincorporated organization that has a place of business in Canada, does business in Canada, or has assets in Canada, and meets the asset and revenue thresholds. If you meet the definition of entity, your activities must include producing, selling, or distributing goods in Canada or elsewhere, importing goods into Canada, or controlling an entity engaged in these activities in order to have reporting obligations under the Act. With regards to the size-related thresholds, an entity must refer to their global total assets, revenue, and employees. And this information should be calculated based on consolidated financial statements. When it comes to producing, selling, distributing, and importing goods in Canada, while it is not defined in the Act, the terms are not intended to capture services that solely support the production, sale, distribution, or importation of goods. So for example, marketing, logistics, administrative services, financial services, and software services are not captured. Entities should apply the ordinary sense of these words to judge whether they're engaged in any of these activities. The terms used in the Act should be understood as excluding any minor dealings. Note that an entity is considered to be importing goods in Canada if the entity is responsible for accounting for those goods under the Customs Act. Another question we receive frequently is related to the formatting of the report. We want to clarify that while it is recommended that the report does not exceed 10 pages or 20 pages when submitted in both official languages, this is not a mandatory requirement. That said, you will only be allowed to upload reports that do not exceed the 100 megabytes in size. So please be mindful of that as you prepare your reports. Another question we receive frequently is with regards to an entity's ability to reuse reports prepared for other jurisdictions. Entities are able to do this if the information is also relevant to the Supply Chains Act and if it covers the same reporting period. It is the responsibility of the entity to ensure the report submitted to the Minister of Public Safety meets all the mandatory criteria under the Supply Chains Act. Although this is not on the slide, but it's another question that we've received, relates to the development of regulations and the compliance enforcement portion. I will reiterate that we are taking an incremental approach to the implementation of the Supply Chains Act in order to increase awareness of the reporting requirements, to build operational knowledge for reporting entities, and to establish engagement mechanisms to improve reporting information over time. It is the entity's legal responsibility to comply with the reporting requirements outlined in the Act and to assume that the information is subject to verification at any time. That being said, in the short and medium term, the department's approach to implementation will focus on compliance promotion. The development of regulations is not currently planned, and compliance promotion and awareness activities are prioritized. This presentation will not be made available. However, all the information contained in this deck is available online at the Public Safety Canada website. I encourage participants to visit our website. Additionally, we will make the recording of this session available for participants and any other requester. If we receive requests to hold additional web sessions like this one, we will provide additional dates. I want to assure you that we are committed to continuing to improve and simplify the reporting process, and we welcome your questions and feedback to strengthen the process for subsequent years. If you have any questions that I did not answer during this information session, please do not hesitate to contact Public Safety Canada at the email address provided on your screen right now. I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. We hope this presentation was useful in providing you insight into the reporting process and requirements of the Supply Chains Act. Thank you again. Have a great day.